I was recently listening to a Q&A episode of Lord of Spirits, as you do. And one of the things which the two very learned fathers on there were asked to talk about by a caller was the idea of the household gods and of household altars and how they related to the later practices of the church, especially as the caller framed it in respect of the canons of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And one of the things that Father Stephen de Young spoke about was the transition from the Roman domestic religion through to early Christian domestic religious practices. And I thought that that would make an interesting video, and it would be interesting to take that narrative which he'd started to explain and to expand on it a bit into its later medieval manifestations. Domestic piety, I find, is a really fascinating and rich subject, which is often overlooked in favour of the more expansive, easily categorised and outwardly exciting sacramental life of the church community, within the context of the church building, within the context of written ritual. In fact, though, domestic piety, and specifically its physical paraphernalia, if you like, has just as rich and interesting a story behind it as do those established rites of the church. To really understand and locate Christian medieval practice, as with many other things in the medieval church, you first have to really have an understanding of how domestic religion functioned and was viewed in its pre-Christian Roman context. Anyone who's ever visited or seen pictures of Pompeii will invariably have come across a panoply of images such as this one. These are shrines, household shrines called lararia. Every household had one, and indeed it was having one of these shrines in a sense that made a household. And they were used for the worship of and to contain statues or images of household deities, household gods, guardians, spirits, especially those called the Lars and the Penates. I'm going to read a little bit from a very excellent thesis on this subject, on the subject of the development of these shrines by Professor David Orr, who observed that, and quote, "The story of Roman domestic worship has great importance in the history of Roman religion. The domestic cult strengthened the ties of the Roman family and symbolized their ancient origins. It continued to flourish in all periods of Roman history and spread throughout the empire. By the worship of the household deities, the Roman could identify with the culture of his ancestors and participate in these ancient rites. Lacking any definite mythology, these household deities reminded the Roman of his past, protected his home from evil, and ensured the continuation of his name." Now, I'll say that there's a couple of things here which we need to explain and which will remain true essentially until we get through into the modern era. The first one being that the domestic cult does not refer primarily to the family as we understand it, but to the notion of the household. There's a difference between these two concepts. The family is a fundamentally modern idea and refers to a small group of people, normally just parents and children, living together under one roof. And then we have the concept of the extended family to deal with many of the outgrowths, if you like, of that. The ancients, however, thought in terms of the household, and the medievals thought in terms of the household, which is a much broader concept and incorporates both biological relationships and those people who are not biologically related to the core family, if you like. Thus, anciently, the household consisted often of several families, as well as more distant relations and other hangers-on and servants and slaves who all inhabited that same physical space as a community. Thus, if we were thinking about these things in terms of the modern day, we might consider a number of setups from a standard nuclear family through to, for example, a group of students inhabiting the same shared house. These would all be categorized as legitimate households and subject, if you like, to the same spiritual parameters that we'll be discussing. This is also the reason why in the Bible, generally, though of course there are many, many exceptions, it's the household which the church is primarily interested in as the smallest unit into which that greater household of Christ can be broken down. For the Roman, just as the priest conducts significant ritual acts on behalf of the other members of the polity at the temple, as a microcosm of the Roman world, of the Roman Empire and of the Roman state, the household's religious organization begins with the head of the household, with the paterfamilias, who served as the spiritual authority and was seen as the domestic priest, conducting the religion of that household with, for and on behalf of the other members of that household who act in a supporting role to him. So what did they actually get up to at these altars? As I've already noted, there seems to have been enormous variation between the practices of different houses, of different households, which were each expected to maintain their own particular traditions and observances. Serious reconstruction of any of these rituals is therefore quite difficult to attempt, and I think it probably explains why there is a real dearth of serious literature on this subject. That said, we can get a rough idea of what might have taken place by piecing together the references which we find in passing sources. This is particularly true of the late Republican period, when writers such as Cato and Tully express disappointment and distress in the apparently declining standards in Roman domestic cult and Roman piety, and contrast their contemporary observances of what they perceive as the decline of society with the stalwart Republican piety of past times when these rites were properly observed. The primary ritual of the day appears to have been in the early morning and consisted of salutations to the protective deities and of a sacrificial offering of one kind or another. This was almost never a blood sacrifice. That is to say, it was almost never an animal which was killed. This was complex. It was, if you like, the next level up of ritual, which required a whole set of apparatus of its own, and was normally carried out in the context of an established state temple, in the context of specific days or occasions, and in the context often of specific meals being celebrated. The domestic sacrifices consisted chiefly of incense, of a sort of mixture of salt and wheat flour, specially prepared by the Vestal Virgins in Rome on a specific day of the year, and this was called mola salsa. It was very important to Roman religion, and of any number of other objects which could then be sacrificed. So most commonly bread, wine, and oil. Occasionally, and seemingly on special occasions for the household or for other reasons, flowers or other vegetation such as laurel was also sacrificed, if you like. It was also offered. Sacrifice was an immolation, immolare, that is, by burning. The destruction of the object by burning was integral to the notion of the ritual itself. That is, while there are references to flowers in particular being placed upon statuettes and of the household gods, and this being an apparently pleasing act for them, particularly when it was done by the young women of the household, it was not the chief mode of transaction with the deity. So to get into what exactly was done, the paterfamilias of the household in the morning would approach the lararium, and he would light a sacred lamp if it wasn't already lit, and pull the back of his toga up over his head to form a sort of hood. And it seems that the Romans may have begun in a not dissimilar way to us. It seems that the Romans may have had some kind of equivalent to our holy water or lustral water, water of lustration, which the Greeks called kernipe, and which was made by extinguishing a special sacred lamp from the temple into water. And it was used like holy water for purification and to distinguish the sacred area of the ritual by sprinkling. And it seems very likely that this was the first act of the ritual. So the paterfamilias therefore approaches the shrine and sprinkles this water on it and around it, and possibly also on the members of the household who are gathered behind him. And this has obvious parallels with our rites of aspersion, and may be their ultimate origin. He then makes some kind of salutation, almost certainly in the form of a short hymn or an ode. A clear example of such a salutation doesn't survive, but Horace in the Odes takes several compositions, creates several such hymns to more well-known deities. So if you'll allow me the liberty, by swapping out a couple of the words, we can arrive at something like the following, which, though entirely speculative, does at least seem to fit the genre or the mode of saying these sorts of things or singing these sorts of things. So he would have said something like, "Hail, O protective guardians of this household. Hail, O ye who are to be worshipped always and venerated. Grant what we pray for in this sacred season." Following this, the paterfamilias would have identified the thing to be sacrificed. So Roman religion was ascribed enormous significance to the identification and preparation of the things which were to be offered to the gods prior to their actual offering, and being very particular as to the reason why they were being offered, on behalf of whom they were being offered, and what one would expect in return. And this was done by looking, by touching, and by lifting, and stating to the deity being worshipped the sort of providence of the act. So let us then imagine that the paterfamilias in this instance is sacrificing bread and oil, which was not necessarily a normal thing for him to do on an everyday occasion. But in any case, he begins by touching it. He looks at it and he lifts it up, and he says a prayer of oblation, not dissimilar to the ones which we find in our rites. Something along the lines of, "Receive, O lares of the house of divers other monks, this oblation which I offer in thy honour, for the protection and prosperity of this household and all who dwell therein. May this sacrifice be acceptable unto you." Now on the shrine there's a small fire burning, and onto this he directly places incense, presumably at this point also with some kind of accompanying words. "May this incense be blessed by those in whose honour it is burned." I'm not exactly sure when the mola salsa was offered, but it would seem that this is the logical point. So it was sprinkled into the fire and then onto the thing being sacrificed, in this case the bread and the oil, also presumably with some form of accompanying words. He then washed his hands in a bowl of water, possibly with the assistance of his wife or with another female member of the family, also presumably with some kind of accompanying prayer, very similar indeed to our rites of the lavabo in the offertory of the Mass. And he's saying, he is probably saying something not dissimilar to the prayers that the priest makes at that point, if not something very, very similar indeed. So now we get to the actual meat of the matter, the actual offering of the sacrifice. At some point, the bread was either soaked in the oil, or the oil was poured over the bread or into the bread. The point of the oil is not to be a sacrifice in itself. That is partially it, but the main point of it is to get the bread to burn, as it would otherwise just sit on the fire, getting more and more charred. The aim here is full immolation, so we can imagine the bread being broken or cut in some way and the wine being poured onto it or into it, so it's a nice kind of combustible lump. This was then placed into the fire and burned. And during this, and during the bread being burned, a hymn would have been sung. And we actually have an example of one of these hymns, which was preserved in the hymnology of a priestly college in Rome called the Arval Brothers. And it goes as follows: "Assist us, O lares, assist us, O lares, assist us, O lares." Let no harm or danger, O Mama, attack our people. Let no harm or danger, O Mama, attack our people. Let no harm or danger, O Mama, attack our people. Be thou satisfied, O fierce Mars, leap thou over the threshold. Stand still, stand still, stand still. Assist us, O Marmor, assist us, O Marmor, assist us, O Marmor. Rejoice, 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 rejoice. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said that. But anyway, that seems to be pretty much it. Now, needless to say, as exciting as this may be, and I do probably have to say it, please don't try this at home. Please do not sacrifice to demons or mythic ancestors. And don't set anything on fire in your house. I should probably make clear that the actual offering of the bread and the foodstuffs also wasn't the default option here. The incense and the mola salsa were apparently the norm. If you're interested in this sort of thing, though, I would highly recommend a book called Pagans by James J. O'Donnell, which takes a really in-depth look into some of the state Roman ritual practices of which this was a variation. And there's an audiobook version of that as well on Audible. Now, Father Stephen de Young made the observation that the early Christians did not simply stop observing comparable domestic religious rites, which were universal in the first millennium. The difference is not in the practice of the rite, but in the orientation of the rite. It's not a question of changing what you're doing, but who you're doing it to or for. This fact is bolstered by the numerous Leraria which we find from late antique times, which seem to blend together a worship of Christ with the worship of traditional deities. This was, of course, suboptimal for what we might think of as the full Christian, that is, the full versus semi-Christian convert. But in any case, it proves the point that domestic religion of this kind continued unbroken into the Christian era. And this is a view which, as Father Stephen also notes, is bolstered by the fact that similar domestic shrines and images have actually been found in first century Jewish contexts as well, as unusual as that might sound to us here today. Naturally, sacrificing bread and oil patties is now out of the window for a Christian, because the sacrifice of the Christian religion is not one that can be conducted in a domestic setting, the primary sacrifice of a Christian religion anyway. But as I mentioned, this would not necessarily have been seen as a distraction from the ritual itself. Incense was and still is in the church seen as a form of sacrificial offering, which is something which the church has always permitted and allowed to be performed by the laity in a domestic context. What we're therefore left with is the outline of a domestic service which might have included something like the following elements. Firstly, the lighting of a sacred lamp. Secondly, the sprinkling of holy water. Third, a salutary hymn or verse. Fourth, the offering of incense accompanied by a dedicatory prayer. And finally, the singing of a dedicatory hymn. Naturally, we can't know exactly precisely what took place, and it's clear that, as I say, these practices varied dramatically from household to household in any case. But given that the later progression of these small domestic services and how they progressed in the Middle Ages, we might be confident that it was some kind of variation on the above. It's also interesting to note, as Father Stephen de Young does, the replacement, if you like, of the Roman gods and spirits, the Lares and the Penates, with patron saints or domestic saints, which became peculiar to the person and to the household, and which very much took the place, in a sense, of these older forms of pagan spirits. Now I want to take a look at two aspects of domestic prayer in the Middle Ages, two examples of domestic prayer, one a written form of prayer and the other a more general application of the kind of physical paraphernalia, which seems to be a kind of progression of these ideas. The first is known as a suffrage. It's a type of prayer known as a suffrage. It's a written formula of prayer dedicated to a particular saint or angel. They're quite brief in their outward content, and the form that I'm about to read is a translation, not my own translation, of one of the brief suffrages to St. Michael the Archangel. Note as you listen the different parts of this devotion. We begin with a salutation, hymn or antiphon, followed by a verse and response, and conclude with a dedicatory prayer. So the antiphon. O Archangel Michael, commander of paradise, come to the aid of the people of God, and be thou willing to defend us from a hostile power, and to lead us with thee into the company of the Lord. Verse and response. In the sight of the angels I will sing unto thee, O my God. At thy holy temple I will adore thee, and to thy name I will confess. Let us pray. O God, who after a marvellous order didst dispose the ministries of angels and of men, grant in thy mercy that our life may be defended on earth by them who stand for ever before thee and minister unto thee in heaven. Through Jesus Christ, thy Son, our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee in the unity of the Holy Ghost, one God, unto the ages of ages. Amen. Now, it isn't particularly difficult to see how formularies such as this could be interpreted as a continuation of a previous traditional mode of address in domestic religion. That is, the salutation, the mediation, and the closing prayer or oblation. We're now some distance away from those early Christian religious practices, but the fundamental development here is still arguably present in the form of the devotions which are being sung. Next, I want to look at how the physical actions associated with such a prayer have developed. And the first thing to observe is that in both the East and the West, contrary to modern Orthodox and Roman Catholic practice, the offering of incense on a regular basis within the domestic context does not seem to have been continued from ancient times. The reason for this is quite obvious. Incense is and always was a very expensive commodity, and in many rural settings was scarcely used in the divine service in a parish church, let alone in private houses, especially following the disruption of the trade routes to the east, which came about as a result of the instability on the frontiers of the Byzantine Empire. It became increasingly difficult to get your hands on incense. Thus, by around the year 735, when Bede died, we note that among his most precious possessions is a small amount of incense, which he was saving to use in the church at special occasions when he was singing Mass. What does seem to have been continued, though, was the use of the sacred lamp or the candle within the home. And there is at least some degree of the use of religious iconography universally. The extent to which the sacred lamp or the candle was a constant feature is difficult to assess, though certain rituals in the medieval church year surrounding baptism and Candlemas especially do suggest that there was at least an occasional use of such a sacred lamp or candle. The development here was very much different to the sort of developments that we're going to see in the East, where icons were placed in prominent places on the exterior as well as the interior of houses. What developed in the West was a feeling of the religious space of the household being an increasingly private area. And as this developed, it shaded increasingly into the shape of the liturgical shrines and setups, which were reaching their full development within the context of the established church buildings. The extent to which a household could successfully accomplish this imitation of the church proper depended very much on, of course, its disposable income and the physical shape and environment of the house, because and that became increasingly differentiated according to the extent to which the household could afford to emulate the areas and iconographic scheme and the rites of the main church building. Thus, we begin to see the physical incorporation within the great households of complete private chapels into the actual fabric of the domestic space, a development which was really unknown in the early Middle Ages, when a communal church, which was also wider was open to the wider community, fulfilled the purpose of serving the household. These chapels were explicitly for the celebration of domestic religion and were increasingly enclosed into the living space itself, at first forming part of the garth of the house and then forming part of the actual structure of the most significant building within it, that of the great house itself. Again, we continue to see dedication of these chapels and the shrines within them to domestic and to protective saints, particularly to the household in question, and to the care of the souls of the household, both living and those who are departed. The rural gentry, and as urbanization begins to take hold, the emergent middle, not really middle classes, but at least merchant classes in the cities, increasingly try to ape this practice of having a dedicated room chapel within the house. And this is normally accomplished by the dedication of a closet, specifically for the purpose of containing an altar shrine. While the great houses would have had consecrated chapels, these lesser closet chapels were only very rarely consecrated, however. And what we're looking at here is a picture of the Virgin Mary in a rather fancy closet chapel. Note on the right-hand side that she's standing at an altar, with an altarpiece of some kind in a niche. But it is still clearly a domestic setting that we're looking at. And here again, we can just about see behind the angel Gabriel that there's a small room here off Mary's bedroom, which contains an altar. So this setup would be a classic example of the kind of geography of a closet chapel. Now, these are obviously somewhat fanciful and exaggerated images of what domestic space looks like. And the reality of these spaces was a lot less spectacular than these pictures might lead you to believe. It's worth mentioning that images of the Annunciation are really fantastic for getting snapshots of medieval domestic setups. So they often go into a lot of detail on the arrangement of furniture and domestic objects. The intention here is to place the Virgin in a conceivably ordinary setting for the contemporary viewers, to which those contemporary viewers could at least notionally relate, even if the architecture is a little bit sort of out there. If you couldn't afford a specifically dedicated space such as this, then there were a range of alternatives. And these range from the kind of all-in-one prie-dieu cabinet, as we can see Mary taking advantage of in this Annunciation, down to the bottom end of society, where they would have made use of small tables, cupboards, images on the wall, or a simple cross, which would have fulfilled the same function. The point here, though, is that all of these spaces, from the castle chapel to the cross on the wall of the peasant's cottage, are in fact a unified class of physical space, and they form a hierarchy of this class of domestic arrangement. They're not, in other words, separate expressions of religious sentiment. There is very much a single thread of understanding of domestic religion at play here. The question as to the privacy of these spaces is an interesting one. As the high medieval period progresses, and particularly into the 14th century, particularly after the Black Death, there's an increased emphasis in spirituality on the inner life. That's as opposed to outward religious attendance and physical practice of religion. This corresponds to an increased notion of the private individual space, and particularly of religious private spaces within the household setup. Thus, where once we were considering shrines and later chapels, which were very much semi-public and even in some sense public spaces, we're now increasingly talking about the domestic shrine or image as the object of personal, as the object of private devotion. The emphasis also moves correspondingly away from the celebration of patron saints of the household toward personal patrons, and meditation on your connection with the saint, on their spiritual life and on their spiritual intercession for you in particular. So in the 14th century, for example, we discover that the inns and the guest houses on the pilgrimage trail to Canterbury out of London, some of which have chapels appended to them, it was not considered okay for a guest to simply go into that chapel and to say their morning prayers. The proper thing to do was to wait to be invited into the chapel by the master of the house in order to participate in the private devotion of the household. So having a look at this Annunciation image, we can also see another prominent development of this later period, which is really coming into its own, and that is the prie-dieu. These are kneelers with small desks attached to the front of them, on which you can see the Virgin Mary saying her prayers here. The thing to notice here is that we've moved away by the high medieval period from the communal acts of worship focused on the shrine altar. Instead, what we have is the book. The book has become a portable shrine. And it is in that context that we have to read the importance of these books containing images. The images are as important as the text because they are the shrine. For that reason, this preference for the cultivation of the inner life has an odd effect on books of prayer. They're special objects, and for women in particular, and because they contain this particular private, bespoke domestic devotion, when they're talked about by their contemporaries, there's increasingly something of a sort of blurring of the line between the personality of the person who owns the book and the physical book itself. It's consequently of great importance, I think, that these books are able to be clasped shut and kept private, and they're only really exposed to trusted friends and to relations, or they're opened in very controlled environments, such as being in church. So now, looking at this image, we can see what the perfect, idealized domestic setup was by the end of the medieval period. The Virgin Mary has just woken up and is engaged in her morning devotions, and she's kneeling on a prie-dieu with her open book of hours in front of her. She's engaged in inner spiritual contemplation, and in the context of a private space, her bedroom, which no one else is permitted access to. Behind her, we can see the evolved version of the domestic shrine. That is a piece of furniture upon which is placed an altarpiece, acting as the notional, if not practical, focus of spiritual devotion. The emphasis here, what we're supposed to take away, is that Our Lady runs a very tight ship. It is the perfect expression of the furniture of the middle of the road medieval domestic religion. It's not shown here, but a light or lamp would have also been an appropriate addition to this setup and is shown elsewhere. I also note that as a teenage girl, Mary has a pin-up on her wall here, although in this case being the Virgin Mary rather than it being Sir Gawain, she's put up a picture of the horned Moses descending from Mount Sinai, though she has badly stuck it to the wall, apparently with bent pins. Concluding our look at the medieval development then with a bit of an insight into the Tudor house, this is an image of Thomas More and his household based on an original by Holbein. What we're looking at here is Thomas and his family engaged in their morning prayers. And it's clear that the role of the paterfamilias is still very much there. But note that we've now moved away from the emphasis on the physical location of the chapel as the seat of domestic piety. Thomas sits in his parlour on comfortable chairs with his relations arrayed around him. Most hold a red-bound prayer book, and we have caught them here either just about to begin or having just finished their morning domestic devotions. Now, the interesting thing is that Thomas certainly has a chapel, but the emphasis here again is that domestic ritual has moved out of that space once again into the personal. The chapel is now associated with the rituals of the priest, and with the domestic space being associated with private introspection and specific devotions designed around the book as the primary object. In a sense, we have come full circle here. As the priest has moved into the chapel, so the paterfamilias once again sets up a complementary religious space in the private sphere. It may appear from this that the household shrine as a physical location and object has faded, but this is actually very much not the case. It is, though, certainly true that the shrine itself has moved into the realm of personal devotional instrument. As we progress into the modern and the early modern period, they become increasingly pieces of tabletop furniture, designed to bring into the home as a sort of setup that one would expect to find in much larger versions in the Baroque churches on the continent. These are two very splendid examples from Germany and the Low Countries, I believe, and perfectly portray this tendency and exemplify the trend that the domestic shrine ultimately took in the Christian West. In the modern West, of course, not only are a lot of things which were not available to our forebears, such as cheap candles and cheap incense and so on, very readily available to us, but there's also an increased influence and interest in the domestic practices of our Eastern brethren, which preserve or at least have been swifter to revive in the context of their icon corners a great deal of the practices of earlier times. I've spoken before about what I consider to be the importance of tactile religion in this channel, and its almost inevitability in the religious life. It's certainly the case that whether it's used for daily prayer or whether those devotions are undertaken elsewhere in a private setting, the home altar, the icon corner, the domestic sacred space at which the physical unifying household religion takes place, is really a vital aspect of traditional religion. That said, what precisely this will come to look like in the modern era and how it comes to be integrated into our daily life, I think is still very much up for grabs and still very much has to be worked out. I would be interested in that vein to hear in the comments section below about your domestic arrangements and whether you have anything that might relate to what I've been talking about here or have anything similar.